At 6:47 on the morning of 14 January 1944, on the frozen western bank of the southern Bug River near the village of Shpikev in central Ukraine, a single Red Army M4A2 Sherman lurched forward through blowing snow, its diesel engine roaring against the cold as German Panzergrenadiers broke from the tree line less than 60 meters ahead. Frost clung to the tank's hull like ash. Ice smoked from its exhaust. The ground shook beneath its tracks as it accelerated directly into a prepared ambush that should have destroyed it within seconds. What none of them could know in that moment was that only 8 minutes earlier the Sherman had been completely dead, its oil frozen solid, its fuel pump locked by ice, its starter burned almost to copper. By all technical logic, the machine should never have moved again, and yet it did. The question that would linger in field reports and half-burned maintenance logs long after the battle was simple and unsettling. How did this happen? By January 1944, the Eastern Front had entered a phase of relentless pressure for the Wehrmacht. Following the collapse of German positions east of Kiev in November, Soviet forces pushed westward in overlapping operations designed to fracture defensive lines rather than simply pierce them. The Red Army's doctrine of deep battle was no longer theoretical. Tank armies were now expected to operate continuously, exploiting gaps, crossing frozen rivers, and maintaining momentum even when supply and repair units lagged far behind. The 1st Guards Tank Army, recently reconstituted after heavy losses, was ordered to press southwest of Vinnytska to disrupt German withdrawal routes and prevent the establishment of new defensive belts along the Bug River. The winter of 1943-1944 was brutally cold in central Ukraine. Night temperatures dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. Snow lay unevenly across fields and forest tracks, driven into hard ridges by wind and freeze-thaw cycles. Engines that ran without shelter at night risked catastrophic failure by morning. Diesel fuel thickened, oil turned to paste, electrical contacts cracked. Even veteran crews feared the dawn. German forces in the sector were experienced and cautious. Elements of a Panzergrenadier regiment, reinforced with Stug's 3 assault guns, had been tasked with delaying Soviet army by establishing mobile ambushes along villages and river crossings.
They relied on concealed anti-tank positions, overlapping fields of fire, and rapid withdrawal once contact was made. Soviet Shermans, recognizable by their boxy silhouettes and foreign design, were considered vulnerable when immobilized, particularly in cold conditions. It was during one such pre-dawn repositioning that the Sherman of Guards Lieutenant Sokolov's platoon failed completely. The tank had halted overnight in a shallow ravine less than 2 kilometers east of Shpikev. The location offered minimal concealment, but some shelter from wind. The crew had followed standard procedure. Engine idled briefly, then shut down to conserve fuel. Canvas was pulled over the engine deck. Snow was packed around the hole for insulation. Still, the cold penetrated everything. Inside the tank, the assistant driver and mechanic, Senior Sergeant Ivan Sergeyev Korneyev, had not slept. At 32 years old, Korneyev had already served 3 winters on the front. He had learned to distrust silence in machines. When the order came to start engines at first light, he felt the resistance in the starter immediately. The switch engaged. The motor turned once. Then nothing. No cough. No vibration. Just the dull finality of frozen steel. Korneyev opened the engine access panel with stiff hands. The smell told him everything before his fingers did. The oil in the crankcase had congealed into a dark, motionless mass. The fuel pump housing was rimmed with ice crystals where condensation had frozen solid. He struck it lightly with a wrench. The sound was wrong. Too dead. Attempts to warm the engine using standard field methods failed. Rags soaked in diesel burned weakly beneath the engine block, their heat carried away by wind. The battery voltage dropped rapidly with each attempt to crank. A fan belt snapped when tension was reapplied, brittle from the cold. The crew exchanged looks without speaking. They all understood the implications. At 6:39, distant rifle fire echoed from the west. German patrols were moving earlier than expected. Radio traffic confirmed enemy infantry probing forward under cover of the snowfall. The platoon commander ordered immediate readiness. Korneyev reported the tank immobile. There was no time for recovery vehicles, no spare engine, no heated shelter. If the Sherman remained where it was, German anti-tank teams would find it within the hour. A stationary tank, especially one known to be foreign-built, was a priority target.
Capture or destruction was inevitable. Korneyev proposed an unorthodox solution. He requested permission to drain the thickened oil directly onto heated exhaust components to re-liquefy it, then reintroduce it into the system, while manually warming the fuel pump housing using heated metal scavenged from the engine bay. The method was dangerous. Oil vapors could ignite. Seals could fail. The engine block could crack under uneven thermal stress. Regulations forbade such actions except in depot conditions. The platoon commander hesitated. At 6:43, mortar rounds began falling on the eastern ridge. Snow erupted in violent plumes. The sound was close enough to feel through the hull. Permission was granted. Korneyev worked without gloves, rotating tasks with the loader to keep blood moving. Heated exhaust fragments were pressed against the pump casing until frost hissed away. Oil was coaxed into motion, then poured back into the engine while still warm. The battery was repositioned closer to the block in a futile attempt to preserve charge. Electrical contacts were scraped clean with a knife. At 6:46, Korneyev shouted for one final attempt. The starter engaged. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the engine fired. The sound was uneven, violent, alive. Black smoke burst from the exhaust, instantly freezing into the air. The crew did not cheer. They braced for failure. Korneyev listened, counting revolutions, watching pressure stabilize. The engine held. Less than a minute later, German infantry appeared through the trees. The Sherman moved forward to meet them. The engine note was wrong. Every man inside the Sherman could hear it. The diesel prattled with uneven rhythm, a strained, metallic cough that suggested damage hidden deep within the block. Korneyev kept his eyes on the oil pressure gauge, willing the needle to remain steady. If pressure dropped now, even briefly, the bearings would seize, and the engine would tear itself apart under load. He said nothing. He knew the commander would order the tank abandoned if there was doubt. Outside, the storm thickened. Wind dragged ice crystals across the ground in long, low sheets. Visibility collapsed to less than 100 meters. For German infantry advancing cautiously through the trees, it was ideal cover. For a tank crew relying on optics already clouded by frost, it was blindness. At 6:49, the platoon radio crackled with broken transmissions. Another Sherman 200 meters to the south reported movement on its flank. The German ambush was unfolding earlier than Soviet estimates had predicted. This was not a probing patrol. This was a prepared kill zone. Lieutenant Sokolov ordered his platoon forward toward the village road, hoping to break contact before heavier German weapons were brought up. One tank stalled almost immediately, its tracks jammed by frozen mud packed solid overnight. Another lagged behind, struggling to engage first gear without stalling. Korneyev felt the strain transfer through the hull as their Sherman lurched uphill out of the ravine. The improvised heating had softened the oil, but it was still thick, resisting flow through narrow channels. The engine temperature climbed rapidly, unevenly. He cracked open a side hatch to vent excess heat, ignoring the risk of small arms fire. Frost-coated air flooded the compartment. At 6:52, the first German anti-tank rifle fired. The impact rang against the hull, sharp but harmless. A second followed, then a third. The Panzergrenadiers had spotted them. German doctrine favored patience. Infantry would fix the target, forcing it to maneuver, while heavier weapons were positioned to deliver the killing blow. Somewhere ahead, concealed behind the low ridge near the village, a Stug 3 assault gun waited with its engine cold, crew listening. The Sherman's main gun traversed left, then right, searching through drifting snow. The gunner fired a single high explosive round into the tree line. The blast shattered branches and sent snow cascading down, but it did not stop the advance. Inside the engine compartment, the fan belt began to fray. Korneyev saw it first. A fine spray of black dust appeared along the housing. The belt, already weakened by cold, was slipping under load.
If it failed completely, the engine would overheat within minutes. There was no replacement on hand. Soviet supply doctrine assumed Shermans would be supported by repair echelons that, in reality, were days behind. He crawled back toward the engine, bracing himself against the jolting hull. Using a strip of canvas torn from a ration bag and soaked in oil, he attempted to reinforce the belt's grip, pressing it into place with a screwdriver while the engine ran. One slip would cost him his hand. The tank hit a frozen rut, throwing him sideways. He held on. At 6:55, German mortar fire bracketed the road. Explosions turned snow into mud.
The tank slewed violently as the right track lost traction, slipping into a shallow ditch. For a moment, it seemed the Sherman would bog down completely. The track jammed against frozen earth. The engine labored. "More power," the commander ordered. Kornev wanted to shout no. He knew what more power would do. The oil was barely circulating. The cooling system was compromised. The belt was failing. But stopping here meant death. He nodded. The driver advanced the throttle. The engine screamed, a sound no mechanic ever wants to hear. For 2 seconds, the Sherman did not move. Then the track bit. Mud and ice flew. The tank surged forward, climbing out of the ditch as another mortar round exploded behind them. Ahead, the village of Shpikiv emerged through the snow. Low wooden houses, fences buried under drifts, a narrow road crossing open ground toward the river. German infantry were already repositioning, moving with discipline, spreading out to avoid a single decisive blast. At 6:58, the Stug fired. The shell passed just ahead of the Sherman's bow, slamming into the road and throwing up a wall of frozen earth. The concussion rocked the tank. The crew froze, waiting for the second shot. It did not come immediately. The Stug crew was adjusting. Range estimation in the storm was difficult. Soviet tanks were not where German gunners expected them to be. The Sherman advanced again, its silhouette barely visible through blowing snow. Kornev felt a sudden drop in engine speed. The oil pressure needle dipped, then recovered. Something inside the engine had shifted, metal expanding unevenly under stress. He could not fix it now. He could only keep it alive. At 7:01, the Sherman fired its main gun at muzzle flash. The round struck the low wall concealing the Stug, collapsing it in a spray of bricks and snow. The assault gun backed away, repositioning, its crew uncertain whether they faced one tank or many. German infantry pressed closer, firing from doorways and tree trunks. Bullets pinged against the hull. One struck the open engine hatch, ricocheting inside before embedding itself in the compartment wall. Kornev flinched but kept working. The fan belt finally gave way. The sound was unmistakable, a sharp crack followed by a sudden change in engine tone. The cooling fan slowed, then stopped. Heat spiked instantly. Steam hissed from the radiator. Kornev acted without orders. He redirected water from the crew's reserve canisters directly onto the hottest sections of the block, controlling the flow to avoid thermal shock. The steam filled the compartment, scalding his hands, fogging his vision. He ignored the pain. At 7:04, the Sherman burst through the German infantry line. The tank's sudden appearance, engine roaring, tracks grinding, gun firing, shattered the ambush's rhythm. Panzergrenadiers scattered, some diving for cover, others retreating toward secondary positions. The Stug fired again, missing wide as the Sherman veered sharply left. For the first time since dawn, the initiative shifted. But the engine was dying. Kornev could feel it in the vibrations, hear it in the uneven cadence. The improvised fix had bought them minutes, not hours. The question was whether minutes were enough. At 7:07, the Sherman reached the far edge of the village. Beyond it lay open ground and the frozen river. The southern bug lay ahead like a white scar across the land, its surface locked beneath thick ice, snow drifting in uneven waves where wind had scoured it bare. The river was usually an obstacle, a natural defensive line that slowed armor and exposed it to fire. In winter, it became something else entirely, a gamble. Ice thickness varied with current, temperature, and depth. Tanks had crossed it before. Tanks had also vanished beneath it without warning. At 7:08, Lieutenant Sokolov hesitated only long enough to judge the surface.
Retreat was no longer possible. German infantry were reforming behind them, and the Stug would soon reappear with better range. The order was given to cross. The Sherman rolled onto the ice with a sound like distant thunder. Each track segment cracked and bit, sending vibrations up through the hull. Korniev braced himself against the engine block, feeling the shudder pass through metal already strained beyond design limits. The cooling system was compromised. Without the fan belt, heat accumulated unevenly. Steam vented constantly now, carrying the sharp smell of scorched oil. Halfway across the river, the engine faltered. For a heartbeat, the tank slowed, its mass shifting dangerously as the ice groaned beneath it. A stall here would be fatal. Recovery under fire was impossible. Abandonment would mean capture or death on the open ice. Korniev did not wait for the commander to speak.
He cut auxiliary loads, disconnected non-essential electrical systems, and manually adjusted the fuel feed to compensate for pressure fluctuations caused by partial icing in the lines. It was a crude solution, the kind taught informally between mechanics who had survived long enough to pass knowledge on. The engine surged again, uneven, but alive. At 7:11, the Sherman reached the western bank. German fire resumed almost immediately. Small arms rounds cracked against the rear armor as Panzergrenadiers pursued cautiously, unwilling to follow the tank onto the ice. The Stug appeared again at the village edge, its silhouette barely visible through drifting snow. It fired once more. The round struck the ice near the riverbank, shattering it in a violent plume of white fragments. Water surged up briefly, then froze again almost instantly. The Sherman climbed the bank and turned north, moving parallel to the river toward a line of low hills dotted with leafless trees. This ground offered partial concealment, and more importantly, time. Time for the rest of the platoon to regroup. Time for German coordination to falter. Inside the tank, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The engine temperature needle crept into the red. The smell of burning insulation mixed with diesel fumes. Electrical wiring, already brittle from cold, began to fail under heat stress. The radio cut out mid-transmission. The turret traverse slowed as voltage dropped. Korniev assessed the engine with brutal honesty. They had perhaps 10 minutes of movement left, less if forced to maneuver aggressively. He informed the commander without embellishment. At 7:14, artillery fire echoed in the distance. Soviet guns were engaging targets beyond the village, part of a broader offensive unfolding across the sector. The Sherman was no longer alone in the fight, but isolation could still kill. German doctrine adapted quickly. Unable to destroy the tank in the initial ambush, Panzergrenadiers repositioned to harass it, probing for weaknesses. A small group moved along a drainage ditch, attempting to flank and disable the tracks with explosive charges. The Sherman's commander spotted them just in time. The main gun fired again. The blast echoed across the frozen fields, scattering snow and bodies alike. The immediate threat dissolved, but the ammunition expenditure added another layer of risk. Shermans carried a limited number of rounds, and resupply was uncertain. At 7:18, the engine began to knock. It was subtle at first, a dull, rhythmic sound beneath the roar. Korniev recognized it instantly. Detonation timing was off, likely caused by uneven fuel vaporization and oil starvation in parts of the block. Continued operation would destroy the engine. Stopping would invite destruction from without. He made a decision that would later be debated in maintenance reports and whispered about in workshops long after the war. He partially flooded one cylinder bank with excess fuel, deliberately reducing efficiency to lower combustion temperatures and slow mechanical damage. The maneuver robbed the engine of power, but stabilized it enough to keep it running. It was a desperate act, born of experience rather than regulation. The Sherman slowed, but it did not stop. At 7:21,
The Stug fired again from long range. The round struck the Sherman's rear hull at an oblique angle, gouging armor but failing to penetrate. The impact shook the engine violently. Steam erupted in a dense cloud, briefly obscuring the tank entirely. When the smoke cleared, the Sherman was still moving. German fire slackened. The ambush had failed. Soviet artillery was drawing closer. The window of opportunity closed. At 7:24, the Sherman reached a shallow depression behind the low hills. Sokolov ordered a halt. The engine was cut immediately to prevent catastrophic failure. Silence fell inside the tank, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the distant thunder of guns. Korniev slumped against the engine block, hands blistered, uniform soaked with oil and steam. He did not speak. He did not need to. Within minutes, other Soviet tanks appeared through the snow, their engines running more smoothly, their crews unaware of how close this one machine had come to being lost. Later that day, as the front advanced westward and German forces withdrew toward prepared positions, a brief entry was made in a unit maintenance log. No further details were recorded. But among the crews who saw it emerge from the snow, among the infantry who watched it crush an ambush that should have destroyed it, the story did not fade. It grew. By midday, the temperature had risen only marginally. The snow continued to fall, lighter now, drifting rather than driving, but the cold remained absolute. The Sherman stood motionless in the shallow depression, while mechanics from the battalion repair section approached cautiously, as if the machine itself might collapse if disturbed.
Steam still leaked from the engine compartment, freezing into thin white crusts along the rear deck. Korniev remained inside the hull as long as his hands would allow. He documented what he could from memory: oil pressure fluctuations, fuel feed behavior, the precise moment the fan belt failed. These details mattered. In winter, memory was often all that remained once parts were gone. When the repair team finally opened the engine bay fully, their expressions told the story. The oil inside was blackened and thinned unevenly. Several seals had deformed. Electrical insulation had charred in places, copper exposed. By standard criteria, the engine should have been condemned. Instead, it had carried the tank through an ambush and across a frozen river. The battalion commander visited briefly that afternoon. He did not offer praise. He asked only whether the machine could be made serviceable again within 48 hours. Korniev answered honestly. With parts, yes. Without them, perhaps. The commander nodded and moved on. The war allowed no room for ceremony. No such modifications existed in any manual. Over the next 2 days, the Sherman was repaired using components scavenged from another disabled vehicle. A replacement fan belt was fitted. Electrical wiring was patched and reinforced. The oil was changed twice to flush out contaminants. The fuel pump housing was insulated with additional canvas and felt, a practice already spreading informally among crews. Korniev slept little. When he did, he dreamed of engines seizing in silence. On 17 January, the tank returned to service. The advance continued westward. Villages changed hands with little warning. Roads alternated between frozen solidity and treacherous mud where thaw had begun. German resistance stiffened in some sectors, collapsed in others. The Sherman participated in 3 further engagements that week, none as dramatic as the first, but each carried the same underlying risk. Cold did not forgive mistakes. Word of Korniev's improvised techniques traveled quietly, not through official channels, but from mechanic to mechanic, whispered over engine noise and shared cigarettes. Drain oil before it freezes. Keep metal warm against metal. Reduce electrical load at the critical moment. Do not trust the gauges entirely. Listen to the machine. None of this appeared in training manuals. Much of it contradicted regulation. All of it kept tanks moving. By February, the front shifted again. Warmer days brought the Rasputitsa, the season of mud. Tracks clogged, engines strained under constant resistance. The Sherman's foreign suspension handled it better than some Soviet designs, but the strain was relentless. Mechanical survival became as much about judgment as about strength. Korniev was wounded in March by shrapnel from an artillery burst while assisting another crew with a stalled engine. The wound was not severe, but infection set in. He was evacuated to a field hospital, then to a rear area repair depot once he recovered. He did not return to the front. The Sherman continued without him. Its fate is uncertain. Records indicate it was transferred to another unit in late spring, then struck from inventory later that year, possibly destroyed or cannibalized. No photograph survives. No crew list remains complete. After the war, Korniev returned to civilian life. He worked in a tractor factory near Chelyabinsk, his hands steady, his hearing diminished. He spoke little about the war unless pressed. Historians would later debate the plausibility of such extreme cold weather improvisation. Some dismissed the accounts as exaggeration. Others noted similar practices in scattered reports across the front. The truth lies between, moments when regulation gave way to necessity, when survival depended on understanding not just how machines were built, but how they failed. In the end, the ambush near Spitkiv became the footnote, a minor engagement in a vast campaign. Yet for those involved, it remained something else entirely, proof that in the frozen chaos of the Eastern Front, a single mechanic, working by instinct and experience, could force a dead machine to move, and in doing so, change the outcome of a battle that no map would ever record.